Hello, listener. It's 11:23 p.m. on day 14 of the outbreak. The emergency broadcast system is operating on backup power from the WGBH transmission facility in Brighton, Massachusetts. I'm the last voice on this frequency because everyone else evacuated 6 hours ago when Boston's primary safe zone at Fenway Park reported perimeter breach. I stayed because someone needs to coordinate what's left of the Northeast Corridor communication network, and because walking out into what Boston has become seemed like a worse option than staying at a microphone in a fortified broadcast facility with 3 days of supplies and doors that still lock. My name is David Morgan. For the past 14 days, I've been broadcasting emergency coordination updates for the Northeast Safe Zone Network. That network, as of 11:23 p.m. tonight, is failing. Not failed. Failing. Present tense. Active collapse. And if you're listening to this broadcast, if you're in one of the remaining safe zones, or if you're in a structure somewhere monitoring emergency frequencies, you need to understand what's happening across the Northeast Corridor right now, because the coordinated response that kept approximately 800,000 people alive for 2 weeks is coming apart in real time. Before I tell you which safe zones are gone and which are going, I need you to do something. If you're watching this later on YouTube, if someone archived this broadcast and you found it months or years after tonight, subscribe to Outbreak FM right now. Not because I need subscribers, because if safe zones failed in the Northeast in 2024, they can fail anywhere, anytime, and the lessons from tonight need to reach people who might face this tomorrow. Hit subscribe. Comment which safe zone you are in, or which city you're listening from. Then understand that what I'm about to describe is what happens when coordinated response breaks down. At 11:25 p.m., I need to give you the current status of the Northeast Safe Zone Network before I tell you how we got here. The network was established on day 3 of the outbreak, when it became clear that isolated survival wasn't viable and that coordinated, large-scale, defensive positions were the only way to manage populations of millions. We established 9 primary safe zones across the corridor from Boston to Washington, D.C. Each zone was designed to hold between 50,000 and 200,000 people. Each had military presence, medical facilities, supply chains, and communication links to the Network Operations Center, which was, until 6 hours ago, located at Fenway Park. As of 11:25 p.m. on day 14, 6 of those 9 safe zones are gone. Gone means perimeter breached, population evacuated or lost, military presence withdrawn, and the facility abandoned to infected control. 3 zones remain operational, but degraded, and the Network Operations Center that was supposed to coordinate all of this is now me, in a radio station in Brighton, watching the command structure collapse through radio traffic and emergency calls and reports from the field that are becoming less frequent as the people who would report are either evacuating or too busy surviving to communicate. At 11:27 p.m., the 6 fallen safe zones are Providence Dunkin' Donuts Center, capacity 80,000, fell on day 12 at approximately 3 p.m. Hartford XL Center, capacity 40,000, fell on day 13 at 9 a.m. New Haven Yale Bowl, capacity 60,000, fell on day 13 at 7 p.m. Springfield Mass Mutual Center, capacity 20,000, fell yesterday at 2 a.m. Worcester DCU Center, capacity 50,000, fell this morning at 6 a.m. And Boston Fenway Park, capacity 120,000, fell at 5 p.m. today. The 3 remaining zones are Portland, Maine Expo, capacity 30,000, currently operational, but reporting critical supply shortages. Manchester, New Hampshire Verizon Arena, capacity 12,000, operational, but isolated from supply routes. And Foxborough Gillette Stadium, capacity 70,000, operational but experiencing perimeter pressure that command staff is describing as unsustainable past dawn. At 11:29 p.m., if you're doing math, That's 6 zones fallen containing approximately 370,000 people, and 3 zones remaining containing approximately 112,000 people. The network that was designed to protect 800,000 people across the Northeast corridor has lost approximately 370,000 to evacuation, casualty, or unknown status, and the remaining 112,000 are in positions that might not hold through tomorrow. At 11:31 p.m., I'm going to tell you how it started, because understanding failure requires understanding what was working before it failed. The Northeast Safe Zone Network was established by FEMA coordination with National Guard units from 6 states. The concept was sound: establish large defensible positions with military security, concentrate civilian populations for efficient resource distribution, maintain communication and supply lines between zones, and coordinate response to threats through centralized command. For 11 days, it worked. Zones maintained security. Supplies moved between facilities. Medical care was provided. People survived in numbers that would have been impossible through isolated household defense. At 11:33 p.m., the failure began with supply chain breakdown. The network required continuous resupply of food, water, medical supplies, fuel, and ammunition. Those supplies came from distribution centers outside the safe zones, transported along secured routes by military convoy. On day 10, the secured routes began failing. Infected populations increased. Military resources became stretched. Convoys required more security personnel to defend, which meant fewer personnel available for zone defense, which meant zones became more vulnerable, which required redirecting convoy security back to zone defense, which meant convoys became more vulnerable. The cycle compounded. At 11:35 p.m., Providence fell first because it was the southernmost zone, and the supply routes from New York had failed completely by day 11. Without resupply, Providence went from operational to critical in 18 hours. Food rationing, water rationing, ammunition conservation. When the perimeter came under sustained pressure on day 12, the defense couldn't hold because the ammunition wasn't there. 80,000 people evacuated north toward Hartford in a convoy that lost approximately 15% of its population to infected attacks during the 50-mile journey. Providence Dunkin' Donuts Center is now an empty facility surrounded by infected. At 11:37 p.m., Hartford fell next because it absorbed Providence's refugees and immediately became overcrowded beyond its designed capacity. 40,000 designed capacity receiving 68,000 actual population created density that made everything harder. Resource distribution, sanitation, medical care. When Hartford's perimeter was breached on day 13, the evacuation was chaotic because there were too many people and not enough vehicles and not enough time. Approximately 30,000 made it to New Haven. The rest scattered north or were lost. At 11:39 p.m., I'm telling you this chronologically because the pattern matters. Each zone that fell created refugees who moved to the next zone north, which created overcrowding, which stressed resources, which weakened defense, which made the next fall more likely. The network was designed for stability. Once it started cascading, each failure accelerated the next failure. By day 13, we weren't managing a coordinated network anymore. We were managing a collapsing system where each zone was a temporary hold waiting for inevitable breach. At 11:41 p.m., the New Haven fall was different because Yale Bowl is a massive outdoor stadium, and the perimeter was always the weakest point. When infected concentrated on the eastern approach in numbers that exceeded defensive capability, the perimeter didn't breach so much as dissolve. 60,000 people evacuated in relatively good order because New Haven Command made the decision to abandon 12 hours before actual breach and used that time for organized evacuation north to Springfield and Boston. New Haven's fall was anticipated and managed. Casualties were lower than Providence or Hartford because leadership made hard decisions early. At 11:43 p.m., Springfield fell at night, which made everything worse. 2 a.m. breach means darkness, means limited visibility, means infected that you can't see until they're close. 20,000 people in Mass Mutual Center became a panicked evacuation in darkness that lost approximately 30% of the population. The survivors reached Worcester by dawn. Worcester absorbed them, became overcrowded, and fell 6 hours later in almost identical circumstances. The dominoes were falling faster. At 11:45 p.m., Boston Fenway Park was designed to be the anchor of the network. 120,000 people, heavy military presence, extensive supplies, central location, command and coordination center. Fenway was where the network would make its stand even if every other zone fell. Fenway held for 14 days while zones around it collapsed. And then today, at 5 p.m., Fenway's western perimeter failed. At 11:47 p.m., I'm going to tell you what Fenway's fall looked like from this frequency, because I was coordinating communications when it happened. The western perimeter breach was reported at 5:03 p.m. By 5:15 p.m., the infected were inside the concourse. By 5:30 p.m., the evacuation order was given. By 5:45 p.m., the command center was relocating to Gillette Stadium. By 6 p.m., Fenway Park was lost, and 120,000 people were in convoy heading south on I-93 toward Foxborough, with infected pursuing and darkness coming, and nowhere else to go except Gillette Stadium, which was already at capacity. At 11:49 p.m., the Fenway evacuation convoy reached Gillette Stadium at approximately 8 p.m. 70,000 people from Fenway joining 70,000 already. At Gillette, created 140,000 people in a facility designed for 70,000. The overcrowding is creating the same conditions that led to Hartford's fall and Worcester's fall. And Gillette's command staff is reporting on the emergency channel that they don't have resources to maintain perimeter security through the night with the current infected pressure. At 11:51 p.m., Portland, Maine, and Manchester, New Hampshire are isolated. Portland is 2 hours north of Boston. Manchester is an hour northwest. Both zones are operationally independent, now because the communication network that linked them to Boston is degraded and the supply routes that sustained them are cut. Portland is reporting they have supplies for approximately 3 more days. Manchester is reporting supplies for 5 days. Both are reporting infected presence increasing, but manageable for now. Neither is reporting evacuation plans because there's nowhere to evacuate to. At 11:53 p.m., I stayed at this facility when everyone else evacuated because someone needed to maintain the emergency broadcast coordination. Because the command structure collapsing doesn't mean communication should collapse too. Because 800,000 people entered this network 14 days ago, and approximately 112,000 are still alive in safe zones, and maybe another 100,000 scattered in isolated positions. And those people deserve to have information, even if the information is that the network is failing. At 11:55 p.m., the infected count in Boston is estimated at over 500,000. The city had a pre-outbreak population of 690,000. The suburbs added another 2 million. The metropolitan area is now largely controlled by infected. The safe zones were islands of defense in a sea of infection. As each island falls, the sea rises. Boston is drowning. At 11:57 p.m., I'm going to stay on this frequency until Gillette Stadium falls or holds, or until this facility's backup power runs out, whichever comes first. I'm going to coordinate what communication still exists. I'm going to relay reports from the field. And I'm going to document what happens when safe zones fall. Stay where you are. Lock your doors. Listen to this frequency. Because the Northeast Safe Zone Network is failing, and someone needs to remember that it existed, and what it tried to do, and why it wasn't enough. At 11:59 p.m., Gillette Stadium Command is reporting on the emergency channel that infected pressure on their northern perimeter has increased significantly in the past 30 minutes. The Fenway evacuation convoy brought not just refugees, but also attracted infected who followed the vehicle south on I-93. That infected concentration is now at Gillette's perimeter, and the defensive line is reporting ammunition concerns. At midnight 01 a.m., we cross from day 14 into day 15. The transition is arbitrary, but it matters psychologically. 15 days ago, the world was normal. 15 days ago, people went to work and school and restaurants. 15 days ago, the word zombie was entertainment instead of tactical reality. 15 days is not enough time to forget what normal felt like. It's enough time to understand we're not getting it back. At midnight, 03 a.m., the Springfield refugees who survived that zone's fall and made it to Worcester before Worcester fell are now scattered across Massachusetts in vehicles and buildings and shelters that aren't coordinated with any command structure. I'm receiving sporadic radio calls from individuals or small groups, reporting their positions and asking for guidance. I'm telling them to shelter in place, conserve resources, and monitor this frequency because I don't have better guidance to give them. At midnight 05 a.m., the Portland, Maine Expo is reporting that they're observing increased infected activity in the surrounding area, but their perimeter is holding. Portland Command is asking about supply convoy from Canadian sources. I'm telling them that Canadian border coordination collapsed on day 11, and no supply convoys from the north are operating. Portland is on its own with 3 days of supplies and no resupply option. At midnight 07 a.m., I need to talk about what happens to people when safe zones fall, because the human element is getting lost in the tactical reporting. When Providence fell, 80,000 people made decisions in minutes about whether to join the evacuation convoy or try to survive independently. Some chose convoy and died when the convoy was attacked. Some chose independent survival and succeeded or failed based on their resources and location and luck. Some froze and made no decision and were overtaken by circumstances. At midnight 09 a.m., the Hartford evacuation scattered approximately 10,000 people who didn't reach New Haven or any other zone. Those 10,000 are somewhere in Connecticut, in an area covering approximately 500 square miles. Some are in homes, some are in businesses, some are in vehicles on roads, some are in groups, some are alone. I receive calls from them occasionally. A family barricaded in a convenience store. A man in a church basement. A group of 12 in a school. They call because they need to hear a voice that represents coordination, even when coordination has failed. At midnight 11 a.m., Manchester, New Hampshire is reporting they're considering preemptive evacuation to northern New Hampshire, where infected density is lower. Manchester Command is asking my assessment. I'm telling them that preemptive evacuation before breach might save lives, but it also abandons defensible position for uncertain terrain. The calculus is known vulnerability versus unknown risk. There's no right answer. Manchester has to make their own decision. At midnight 13 a.m., the temperature in Boston tonight is 48 degrees. November in Massachusetts. Cold, but not freezing. The cold affects infected mobility slightly, but not enough to matter tactically. What matters more is that 48 degrees without heat in buildings is survivable with proper clothing. People sheltering in structures without power can survive the night if they're prepared. At midnight 15 a.m., Gillette Stadium is reporting they've repelled the initial northern perimeter pressure, but ammunition expenditure was higher than sustainable for extended defense. Gillette Command estimates they can maintain current defense intensity for approximately 6 to 8 hours before ammunition becomes critical. Dawn is at 6:32 a.m. That's 6 hours and 17 minutes. Gillette might not make it to sunrise. At midnight 17 a.m., I'm receiving reports through ham radio operators who are monitoring infected movement patterns across the region. The reports describe infected concentrating towards safe zones in numbers that suggest attraction to large population centers. The safe zones created exactly what infected are drawn to: concentrated human presence with noise and light and activity. We built fortresses to protect people and simultaneously built targets that attracted every infected in range. At midnight 19 a.m., the New Haven evacuation succeeded relatively well because Command made early decisions. That success is instructive. The safe zones that held longest and evacuated best were the ones with leadership willing to make hard calls early. The zones that fell catastrophically were the ones where Command waited too long or hoped conditions would improve, or couldn't make the decision to abandon until circumstances forced it. Leadership quality mattered more than defensive capability. At midnight 21 a.m., I need to address something about this broadcast. I'm one person in a fortified radio facility providing coordination for a network that's mostly gone. The question is whether this broadcast matters, whether one voice on a frequency changes outcomes. I don't know if it does. What I know is that people call this frequency, and they say the broadcast helps them feel connected to something larger than their immediate isolation. That might not be tactical value, but it's human value. And tonight, human value is all that's available. At midnight 23 a.m., Portland, Maine is asking if there are any operational safe zones south of them that could receive evacuees if Portland decides to abandon. I'm telling them that Gillette Stadium is overcrowded and under pressure. I'm telling them that Boston zones are fallen. I'm telling them that their best option for evacuation is north into rural Maine, where infected density is lower even though there's no organized safe zone in that direction. Portland is acknowledging and discussing options. At midnight 25 a.m., the pattern of safe zone failure is now clear enough to identify. Zones fail when supply lines fail. Supply lines fail when infected density makes convoy operations impossible. Infected density increases as zones attract infected, and as infected from fallen zones spread. The system was designed for stability, but contained inherent instability. Each zone needed continuous support. When that support failed, the zone failed. And each failed zone accelerated the next failure. At midnight 27 a.m., Gillette Stadium Command is reporting civilian unrest inside the facility. 140,000 people in a space designed for 70,000 creates density that makes everything harder. Sanitation is failing. Food distribution is strained. Medical facilities are overwhelmed. People are frightened, and some are demanding evacuation, and some are demanding stronger defense, and Command is managing competing pressures while also managing actual infected at the perimeter. At midnight 29 a.m., the question that people keep asking on radio calls is, where do we go if safe zones fail? What's the plan after safe zones? I'm telling them the truth, which is that there is no coordinated plan after safe zones. The safe zone network was the plan. It was FEMA's response to an unprecedented crisis. It represented the best thinking about how to protect large populations. And it's failing. What comes after is decentralized survival. Small groups, isolated structures, individual decisions. There's no network after the network falls. At midnight 31 a.m., I'm tracking military radio traffic because National Guard coordination is separate from civilian emergency broadcast, but I monitor their frequencies. The Guard is reporting that they're consolidating forces at Gillette Stadium and preparing for what they're calling managed evacuation if perimeter fails. Managed evacuation is military terminology for organized retreat. They're preparing to abandon Gillette the same way they abandoned Fenway and Worcester and Hartford. At midnight 33 a.m., the Springfield survivors who called earlier are reporting that they're observing infected moving south on I-91 toward Connecticut. The infected movement isn't random. They're following roads because roads connect to destinations and destinations have people. The highway system that was designed to connect cities is now infrastructure that infected used to spread between population centers. At midnight 35 a.m., Manchester is reporting their decision. They're evacuating north into New Hampshire toward the Lakes region, where they believe infected density is lower and where terrain might be more defensible. 12,000 people are preparing for convoy operations at first light. Manchester is abandoning the safe zone before breach in hope that preemptive evacuation saves lives. It's the same decision New Haven made. Whether it succeeds depends on execution and luck. At midnight 37 a.m., I need to talk about what I'm seeing from this frequency that might not be visible from ground level. The Northeast Corridor is approximately 400 miles from Washington, D.C. to Portland, Maine. 14 days ago, that corridor contained approximately 40 million people. The Safe Zone network protected approximately 800,000. That's 2% of the pre-outbreak population. The other 98% survived or died outside the network. Most died. Some survived in isolation. The Safe Zone network was never designed to save everyone. It was designed to save who it could with available resources. At midnight 39 a.m., the resources are now exhausted. The military can't defend 9 zones simultaneously. The supply chains can't support 800,000 people indefinitely. The medical facilities can't treat the continuous casualties. The communication network can't coordinate when command centers keep relocating because their facilities fall. Every system has limits. 14 days found those limits. At midnight 41 a.m., Gillette Stadium is reporting perimeter breach on the eastern approach. Command is ordering evacuation. 140,000 people are being directed to vehicles and to secondary defensive positions and to anything that moves them away from the facility. The anchor of the Northeast Safe Zone network is falling. The last major defensive position between Boston and Portland is being abandoned. At midnight 43 a.m., I'm going to stay on this frequency and coordinate what I can coordinate. I'm going to relay reports from the field. I'm going to provide whatever guidance I can provide. And I'm going to document what happens when the safe zones fall and people are forced to survive without the network that promised protection. The Northeast Safe Zone network is failing. I'm watching it fail in real time. And I'm broadcasting that failure because someone needs to remember that we tried. At midnight 45 a.m., Gillette Stadium Command is reporting that the evacuation is chaotic. 140,000 people attempting to leave a facility through limited exit points creates compression and panic and crush injuries before infected ever reach the crowd. Military police are trying to manage flow, but they're overwhelmed by the sheer numbers. The eastern perimeter breach is spreading to southern sections. Infected are inside the facility. At midnight 47 a.m., I'm receiving radio calls from individuals inside Gillette reporting conditions that are deteriorating rapidly. Families separated in crowds. Children lost. Elderly unable to move fast enough. The evacuation that was supposed to be managed is becoming a stampede. This is what Hartford looked like. What Worcester looked like. The pattern repeats. At midnight 49 a.m., Portland, Maine is reporting they're observing the Gillette evacuation reports and making their own decisions accordingly. Portland Command is deciding to evacuate immediately rather than wait for their own breach. 30,000 people in Portland are being directed to move north into Maine tonight instead of waiting for dawn. Portland is learning from Gillette's failure. At midnight 51 a.m., the National Guard is reporting that they're establishing rally points outside Gillette for military personnel and for evacuees who can reach them. The rally points are being set up in parking areas and on highway sections where defensive perimeters can be established temporarily. The goal is to consolidate people into groups that can be protected during movement, north or west away from the infected concentration around the stadium. At midnight 53 a.m., I need to address what happens to the people who don't reach rally points, who don't get to vehicles, who get separated from groups, who end up alone or in small clusters without coordination or direction. Those people become the scattered survivors I've been receiving calls from all night. They find buildings. They barricade doors. They hope someone will coordinate rescue. Mostly, nobody does. They survive or don't survive based on their resources and their decisions and their luck. At midnight 55 a.m., the temperature has dropped to 46 degrees. The November night is getting colder. People evacuating Gillette in summer clothes because they didn't expect to evacuate tonight are going to face hypothermia risk in addition to infected risk. Cold kills in New England. Slower than infected, but just as dead. At midnight 57 a.m., Manchester's evacuation convoy is forming up in their parking areas. 12,000 people loading into vehicles under darkness with limited organization. Manchester Command is doing better than Gillette because they're evacuating before breach instead of during breach. The difference is pressure. Without infected inside the perimeter yet, people can move in relatively organized groups instead of panic. At midnight 59 a.m., I'm receiving a radio call from someone identifying as Gillette Stadium medical officer. She's reporting that the medical facility inside the stadium has been abandoned because medical staff had to evacuate with everyone else. There are patients who couldn't be moved, injured, sick, immobile. They're still in the medical facility because there was no time and no resources to evacuate them. She's asking if rescue is possible. I'm telling her I don't know. I'm telling her that military resources are focused on establishing rally points and that individual rescue isn't possible right now. At 1:01 a.m., the medical officer understands what I'm saying. She understands that the people left in Gillette's medical facility are being abandoned by necessity. She's asking if I can broadcast their location in case anyone listening has capability to help. I'm broadcasting it. Gillette Stadium Medical Facility, Lower Concourse, Eastern Side. Approximately 20 patients unable to evacuate. I don't know if anyone listening can help them, but broadcasting the information is what I can do. At 1:03 a.m., Gillette Command is reporting they've lost communication with several military units that were maintaining perimeter sections. Lost communication means those units either evacuated or overrun or are too busy fighting to report. The command structure at Gillette is disintegrating the same way Fenway's command structure disintegrated 6 hours ago. When facilities fall, organization falls with them. At 1:05 a.m., Portland's evacuation is underway. 30,000 people in convoy, heading north on I-295 toward Augusta and the interior of Maine. Portland Command estimates they'll reach relatively lower infected density within 2 hours if the convoy maintains cohesion. The convoy is long, vulnerable, slow, but it's moving before breach instead of during breach, and that gives them better odds than Gillette. At 1:07 a.m., I'm receiving multiple reports of infected concentrations along Route 128 around Boston. Route 128 is the highway that circles Boston suburbs. The concentrations suggest infected are being drawn from the urban core toward suburban areas, possibly following sound and movement from the safe zone evacuations. The suburban ring that used to be residential neighborhoods is becoming contested terrain. At 1:09 a.m., the question I keep getting asked is whether there are any safe zones left anywhere, whether the network collapsed only in the Northeast, or whether it's failing everywhere. I don't have information about safe zones outside the Northeast corridor. This broadcast is regional. Communication with other regions failed days ago when national coordination networks collapsed. For all I know, safe zones in other regions are holding successfully. Or they fell before ours did. I don't know, and I can't know from this position. At 1:11 a.m., Manchester is reporting their convoy has cleared the immediate Manchester area and is proceeding northwest toward the Lakes region. Traffic is light because most people either evacuated days ago or died days ago. The highways that used to be congested are now nearly empty. Manchester convoy is making good time. At 1:13 a.m., I need to talk about something that's been evident in radio traffic all night, but that hasn't been stated explicitly. The military is prioritizing their own survival now instead of civilian protection. That's not criticism. That's observation. When Gillette fell, the Guard established rally points for military personnel first and civilian evacuees second. When convoys organize, military vehicles are positioned for their own defense first. The military is transitioning from protecting civilians to surviving alongside civilians. The mission changed when the safe zones fell. At 1:15 a.m., Gillette Stadium is reporting that the facility is substantially evacuated. Approximately 90% of the population reached vehicles or rally points. Approximately 10% are unaccounted for. Some are dead. Some are trapped. Some escaped in directions that weren't monitored. The facility that was the anchor of the network is now abandoned, and infected are occupying the concourses in the field and the seats where 14 days ago people were watching football games. At 1:17 a.m., the rally points outside Gillette are being consolidated. Military command is organizing evacuees into convoys that will move west toward Worcester or north toward New Hampshire. The organization is imperfect, but it's functioning. People are in groups. Groups are being directed to destinations. The chaos of the evacuation is being replaced by the controlled chaos of managed retreat. At 1:19 a.m., I'm receiving calls from the people who didn't reach rally points, who got separated, who are in vehicles alone or in small groups without direction. They're asking where to go. I'm telling them to head away from Boston, toward rural areas where infected density should be lower, west toward Worcester and the Berkshires, north toward New Hampshire, northeast toward Maine, if they can reach it, away from concentration toward dispersal. That's the only guidance I have. At 1:21 a.m., the New Haven survivors who evacuated successfully to Springfield, and then survived Springfield's fall and made it to Worcester, and then survived Worcester's fall, are now scattered across central Massachusetts. I received a call from someone identifying as a New Haven evacuee who has been in 4 different safe zones. Providence briefly before it fell. New Haven, Springfield, Worcester. Each time evacuating before breach or during breach and reaching the next zone just in time for that zone to fall too. That person is now in a farmhouse in rural Massachusetts with 11 other people and no plan except to stay there until circumstances force movement. At 1:23 a.m., Portland is reporting their convoy has reached Augusta without significant incident. 30,000 people are establishing temporary defensive positions in Augusta's civic infrastructure, schools, government buildings, large facilities that can hold populations. Portland is transitioning from organized safe zone to dispersed survival in a new location. Whether Augusta holds longer than Portland depends on infected density in central Maine and on how long supplies last. At 1:25 a.m., Manchester's convoy is reporting they've encountered infected on Route 93 north of Concord. A convoy is engaging and pushing through. Manchester Command is reporting casualties, but the convoy is maintaining cohesion. Preemptive evacuation is succeeding better than emergency evacuation, but it's not succeeding without cost. At 1:27 a.m., I'm going to stay on this frequency and continue coordinating. The Northeast Safe Zone network is gone. Gillette was the last anchor, and it fell. What remains is scattered groups and isolated survivors and convoys moving toward uncertain destinations. The coordinated response has devolved into decentralized survival, and I'm broadcasting to whoever's listening, because coordination failed, but communication shouldn't fail too. The safe zones fell. I watched them fall. And tomorrow morning when the sun rises over New England, approximately 100,000 people are going to be in positions they didn't plan to be in, trying to survive another day without the network that promised protection. At 1:29 a.m., the National Guard is reporting that they've consolidated approximately 60,000 Gillette evacuees at 3 rally points. Rally Point Alpha, west of the stadium on Route 1. Rally Point Bravo North on I-95. Rally Point Charlie Southwest on Route 140. Each rally point is organizing convoys to move evacuees away from the Boston infected concentration. The military efficiency that managed safe zone defense is now being applied to managed evacuation. At 1:31 a.m., I'm receiving reports that infected from the Gillette breach are spreading into surrounding Foxborough and the adjacent suburbs. The concentration that was contained at the stadium is now dispersing into residential areas. The homes that surrounded Gillette Stadium for decades are now becoming infected territory. Foxborough is being abandoned by anyone with capability to leave. At 1:33 a.m., Portland's position in Augusta is being reinforced. They're establishing perimeter defense similar to what they had in Cortland, but with more distributed positioning across multiple buildings instead of one centralized facility. Portland Command is learning from safe zone failures and adapting their defensive approach. Whether adaptation succeeds where centralization failed won't be known until Augusta faces serious infected pressure. At 1:35 a.m., the question people keep asking is how many safe zones exist elsewhere in the country, whether this is regional failure or national failure. I'm telling them what I told earlier callers. I don't know. National communication networks failed days ago. For all I know, safe zones in the Midwest or West Coast or South are functioning successfully. Or they fell before ours. Or they're falling simultaneously. This broadcast is regional, and I don't have national visibility. At 1:37 a.m., Manchester is reporting their convoy has reached the Lakes region and is establishing positions in Laconia and surrounding towns. 12,000 people are dispersing across approximately 10 miles of lakefront communities. Manchester is adopting the dispersed model that Portland is using. Lessons from centralized safe zone failures are being applied in real time by commanders who are adapting faster than the system they came from. At 1:39 a.m., I need to talk about the civilians who organize their own survival outside the safe zone network. The people who never entered zones, who stayed in their homes or businesses or found defensible positions independently. Some of those positions held for 14 days while safe zones fell around them. A family in a fortified suburban home. A group in a commercial building with supplies and defensive capability. These independent survivors succeeded where the coordinated network failed, not because their positions were stronger, but because they were invisible. They didn't attract infected the way safe zones did. At 1:41 a.m., the temperature is 44 degrees and dropping toward the overnight low. The National Weather Service automated broadcasts are still running on emergency power, and they're forecasting a low of 38 degrees by dawn. 38 degrees is cold enough to matter for people evacuating without proper clothing. Cold enough to create hypothermia risk for anyone exposed for extended periods. The night is becoming as dangerous as the infected for unprepared evacuees. At 1:43 a.m., Gillette Rally Point Alpha is reporting they're beginning convoy operations westward toward Worcester and beyond. Approximately 20,000 evacuees are being organized into vehicle groups with military escort. A convoy is targeting the Berkshires region of western Massachusetts, where terrain is more defensible and infected density is believed to be lower. The convoy won't arrive before dawn, but if they maintain speed, they'll reach relative safety by midday. At 1:45 a.m., I'm receiving a call from someone identifying as a Boston firefighter who was at Fenway when it fell and at Gillette when it fell, and who is now in a fire station in Quincy with approximately 30 other first responders who are maintaining the station as a defensive position. A firefighter is asking if there's any coordinated plan for first responders, or if they're operating independently now. I'm telling him that coordination has failed and first responders are making their own decisions about whether to maintain positions or evacuate. The firefighter is acknowledging and stating they're going to hold the fire station as long as possible. At 1:47 a.m., the pattern I'm seeing in radio calls is that professional first responders, police, firefighters, EMS, are more likely to maintain positions even after safe zones fall. They're trained for crisis response. They have defensible facilities. They have resources and equipment. And they have a professional identity built around staying when civilians evacuate. Some of those first responders are going to survive in their maintained positions. Some are going to die defending facilities, and nobody required them to defend except their own sense of duty. At 1:49 a.m., Portland is reporting that Augusta's defensive positions are being tested by infected probes. Not serious assault, exploratory pressure. The infected concentration in central Maine is lower than Boston, but it's not zero. Portland Command is managing the defense with the experience they gained from 2 weeks of safe zone operations. The difference is that Augusta has 30,000 people in dispersed positions instead of concentrated in one facility. At 1:51 a.m., Manchester is settling into Laconia positions. The Lakes region terrain provides natural barriers that limit infected approach routes. Water on multiple sides. Hills and forests that channel movement. Manchester Command is explicitly stating they believe the terrain advantage will allow them to hold positions longer than the flat open terrain around Manchester City did. Terrain matters in defense, and Manchester is applying that lesson. At 1:53 a.m., I'm tracking military radio traffic about ammunition status because ammunition determines defensive capability. The guard units that defended safe zones for 14 days consumed enormous quantities of ammunition. Resupply became impossible when supply routes failed. The units organizing evacuations tonight are reporting critically low ammunition stocks. Some units are estimating they have ammunition for one serious engagement, maybe two. After that, defensive capability becomes limited to whatever weapons don't require ammunition. At 1:55 a.m., the Springfield and Worcester survivors, scattered across central Massachusetts, are self-organizing into small groups based on proximity and capability. I'm receiving reports of groups forming in towns like Palmer, Ware, Belchertown. Groups of 20 to 50 people establishing defensive positions in schools or municipal buildings. These groups aren't coordinated with each other, but they're applying lessons from safe zone experience. They're establishing perimeters, rationing supplies, and preparing for sustained defense. At 1:57 a.m., the Gillette Medical Facility patients who couldn't evacuate are no longer responding to radio calls. The medical officer who called earlier hasn't called back. The silence suggests either the facility was overrun or the people inside are too occupied with immediate survival to communicate. Either way, those patients are lost to communication and probably lost to survival. The calculus of triage during evacuation means some people are left behind. It's horrible and it's necessary, and it's something that everyone making those decisions is going to process for the rest of their lives. At 1:59 a.m., I need to address what tomorrow looks like for the approximately 100,000 people who survived tonight's safe zone failures. Tomorrow, they wake up in convoy vehicles or in temporary defensive positions or in buildings they barricaded during evacuation. Tomorrow, they assess their resources and their situation, and they make decisions about what comes next. Some will attempt to reach family in other regions. Some will fortify their current positions. Some will join with other groups. Some will attempt independent survival. There's no coordinated plan because the coordination structure is gone. At 2:01 a.m., Portland is reporting successful defense of their initial probe. Augusta positions held with minimal ammunition expenditure. Portland Command is expressing cautious optimism that dispersed defense in defensible terrain might succeed, where centralized defense in flat terrain failed. Cautious optimism is the most positive assessment I've heard in hours. At 2:03 a.m., Manchester is reporting similar success, holding their Laconia positions against small infected encounters. The Lakes region is providing the terrain advantage they anticipated. Manchester Command is establishing rotating watch schedules and supply rationing protocols. They're settling in for extended defense rather than planning near-term evacuation. At 2:05 a.m., Gillette Rally Point Bravo is beginning convoy operations north toward New Hampshire. Approximately 20,000 evacuees are moving in the same direction Manchester went earlier. The northern route toward New Hampshire and Maine seems to be becoming the primary evacuation direction for Boston area survivors. South toward Providence is infected territory. West is uncertain. North is the path that seems most viable. At 2:07 a.m., I'm receiving fewer calls than earlier in the night. Either people have evacuated to positions where they don't have radio access, or they're too busy surviving to call, or they've been lost to infection or casualties. The decrease in radio traffic suggests the immediate crisis peak is past, and people are settling into whatever positions they've established. The chaos of evacuation is being replaced by the tension of defended positions. At 2:09 a.m., the temperature is 41 degrees. The overnight low is approaching. Dawn is 4 hours and 23 minutes away. The people in convoy vehicles have heat. The people in buildings have shelter. The people caught between positions have cold and darkness and risk. November in New England. Cold kills. At 2:11 a.m., I'm going to continue broadcasting through the night. I'm going to coordinate what remains to coordinate. I'm going to relay information between groups that can't communicate directly. And I'm going to document what happened when the Northeast Safe Zone network failed. 6 zones fallen. 3 zones evacuated. Approximately 100,000 survivors scattered across 4 states. The network that promised protection for 800,000 collapsed in cascade failure. And I'm the voice recording that failure for whoever listens later. At 2:13 a.m., the National Guard is reporting that they've successfully moved approximately 80,000 evacuees away from the Gillette area through the 3 rally points. Rally Point Alpha convoy reached Worcester area and is proceeding west. Rally Point Bravo convoy is in southern New Hampshire. Rally Point Charlie convoy is in northern Rhode Island heading toward Connecticut. The coordinated evacuation that seemed chaotic at midnight has succeeded in moving most Gillette survivors to safer positions. At 2:15 a.m., Portland is reporting that their Augusta positions have been quiet for the past hour. No infected encounters since the initial probe. Portland Command is using the quiet to reinforce perimeters and redistribute personnel across their dispersed positions. The 30,000 people in Augusta are establishing something. That looks like organized defense instead of emergency evacuation. At 2:17 a.m., I'm receiving a call from Rally Point Alpha convoy. They're reporting that they've reached Worcester, and they're observing that Worcester is largely abandoned, but not completely overrun. The infected concentration is lower than Boston. Buildings are intact. Infrastructure is functional. Rally Point Alpha is considering establishing temporary positions in Worcester instead of continuing west. Worcester failed as a safe zone yesterday morning, but it might be viable as a dispersed defensive area. At 2:19 a.m., the concept of reoccupying failed safe zones is interesting. Worcester fell because it was overcrowded after absorbing Springfield refugees, and because ammunition ran out during sustained defense. But Worcester's buildings are still there. The infrastructure is functional. If a smaller population occupied Worcester with different defensive strategy, it might hold where the safe zone failed. Rally Point Alpha is discussing whether to attempt it. At 2:21 a.m., Manchester is reporting all positions secure in Laconia. The Lakes region terrain is providing the defensive advantage they needed. 12,000 people are distributed across enough buildings and enough terrain that they're not presenting the concentrated target that Manchester City presented. Manchester Command is stating explicitly that dispersed defense in good terrain is succeeding where centralized defense in poor terrain failed. At 2:23 a.m., the temperature has reached the overnight low of 38 degrees. This is the coldest point of the night. People in vehicles with heat are fine. People in buildings are cold, but survivable. People outdoors or in unheated spaces are at hypothermia risk. The cold is affecting infected too. Infected mobility decreases in cold temperatures. Not enough to make them harmless, but enough to slow them noticeably. At 2:25 a.m., I'm going to talk about what I'm learning from monitoring multiple groups simultaneously through this broadcast. Portland's dispersed model is working. Manchester's terrain selection is working. Rally Point Alpha's consideration of Worcester reoccupation is adaptive thinking. The survivors of safe zone failures are applying lessons in real time and succeeding at smaller scale where the network failed at large scale. Decentralized survival is emerging as viable where centralized coordination collapsed. At 2:27 a.m., the New Haven survivors who called earlier from their farmhouse are reporting that they're observing infected moving past their position on a rural road outside. The infected are following the road south, probably toward population centers. The farmhouse group is maintaining quiet and darkness and is not being noticed by passing infected. Their invisibility is their defense. The infected are looking for concentration and bypassing isolation. At 2:29 a.m., Rally Point Bravo convoy is reporting they've reached positions in southern New Hampshire near Nashua and are establishing defensive positions in commercial districts. Approximately 20,000 people are occupying shopping centers and business parks that have good visibility and defensible perimeters. Rally Point Bravo Command is adopting the dispersed model that's working for Portland and Manchester. At 2:31 a.m., the Boston firefighter in Quincy calls back. He's reporting that his fire station has been reinforced by additional first responders who evacuated from other positions and found the station. Approximately 50 people now defending a fire station that was designed for 20. They have equipment, they have supplies, and they have professional training. The firefighter believes they can hold the position indefinitely if infected pressure doesn't exceed their defensive capability. At 2:33 a.m., I'm receiving reports of successful small group defenses across the region. A police station in a Boston suburb with 30 officers. A hospital wing in a smaller city with medical staff and patients. A school in a rural town with a community group. These are the survivors who didn't enter safe zones or who evacuated early. Their success rate appears higher than safe zone success rate because they never concentrated into targets that attracted massive infected response. At 2:35 a.m., Portland is reporting that they're establishing supply rationing protocols in Augusta. Food for 14 days at current consumption. Water adequate for municipal systems that are still functional. Medical supplies limited, but sufficient for basic care. Portland Command is planning for extended defense rather than near-term evacuation. Augusta is becoming a functional defensive position. At 2:37 a.m., Rally Point Alpha convoy decides to attempt Worcester reoccupation. 20,000 evacuees are establishing positions across Worcester in a dispersed pattern instead of concentrated in one facility. They're using the DCU center that failed as a safe zone as one position among many instead of the only position. Multiple smaller defensive points instead of one large target. It's experimental, but it's learning from failure. At 2:39 a.m., Manchester is reporting that Laconia positions are being organized into self-sufficient defensive clusters. Each cluster has approximately 1,000 people, its own supplies, its own defensive perimeter, and its own command structure. Manchester is creating redundancy so that if one cluster fails, it doesn't cascade to others. They're building resilience into the system. At 2:41 a.m., I need to address casualties because the human cost of tonight is significant. I don't have complete numbers. Communication is too fragmented for complete accounting, but based on reports from fallen safe zones and evacuation convoys, I estimate tonight's casualties at approximately 20,000 to 30,000 people. That's people who died during zone breaches, during evacuations, during convoy attacks, or who are missing and presumed lost. 20 to 30,000 out of approximately 140,000 who were in zones that fell tonight. At 2:43 a.m., the casualty rate of approximately 20% is devastating in human terms and remarkable in crisis response terms. 80% survival during the collapse of 6 major safe zones and the emergency evacuation of 3 more represents effective crisis management even as the system failed. The military and civilian leadership that managed those evacuations saved approximately 120,000 lives, while losing approximately 20 to 30,000. Both numbers matter. At 2:45 a.m., the temperature is beginning its slow climb back toward dawn. 38 degrees now, probably 40 degrees by 3 a.m., 45 by 4 a.m., 50 by sunrise. The coldest part of night is over. People who survived the cold can survive until daylight. At 2:47 a.m., I'm receiving a call from someone identifying as FEMA coordinator who was at Fenway Command and evacuated to an unknown location when Fenway fell. The coordinator is asking if I have contact with any functioning FEMA command structures. I'm telling him that I don't. That communication. Networks collapsed, and I'm operating independently from this broadcast facility. The coordinator acknowledges and states that he's going to attempt to reach FEMA regional headquarters in New York if it still exists. At 2:49 a.m., the question of whether FEMA regional or national command structures still exist is significant. If they exist and are functional, there might be coordinated response at larger scale. If they've collapsed like the Northeast Safe Zone network, then all response is local and decentralized. I don't know which is true. From this position, I can't know. At 2:51 a.m., Portland is reporting continued quiet in Augusta. Hours since last infected contact, Portland Command is expressing growing confidence that their position is viable for extended defense. 30,000 people in dispersed positions with adequate supplies and defensible terrain. Portland might have succeeded in finding what the safe zone network couldn't provide: sustainable defensive position. At 2:53 a.m., Manchester is reporting similar success in Laconia. The dispersed cluster model is working. Each cluster is self-sufficient. Each cluster is defending successfully. Manchester's 12,000 people are organized into 12 clusters of approximately 1,000 each. Redundancy and resilience built into the structure. At 2:55 a.m., Rally Point Alpha's Worcester reoccupation is being organized. 20,000 people establishing positions across the city. The city that failed as a centralized safe zone yesterday morning is being reoccupied as a dispersed defensive area tonight. Whether it succeeds depends on whether the lessons from safe zone failures translate to effective decentralized defense. At 2:57 a.m., I'm going to stay on this frequency through dawn and beyond. The crisis peak is past, but the situation remains dynamic. Groups are establishing positions. Survivors are organizing defense. And someone needs to coordinate communication between groups that can't coordinate directly. The Northeast Safe Zone network fell. I watched it fall zone by zone. And now I'm watching the survivors build something different from the pieces. Whether what they're building succeeds where the network failed won't be known for days or weeks. But they're building. They're adapting. They're surviving. At 2:59 a.m., the National Guard is reporting that all 3 Rally Point convoys have reached their intended destinations or established positions. Approximately 80,000 Gillette evacuees are now in defensive positions in Worcester, southern New Hampshire, and northern Rhode Island. The coordinated evacuation that began in chaos succeeded in moving people to relatively safer locations. The military efficiency that defended safe zones is now being applied to disperse defense. At 3:01 a.m., I'm receiving reports from smaller groups across the region that are reporting their positions and status. A family in a fortified house in suburban Boston. A community group in a church in rural Vermont. A group of survivors in a shopping mall in Connecticut. These scattered groups represent the decentralized survival that's emerging from safe zone collapse. No coordination between groups. No central command. Just independent positions maintained by people who are adapting to new reality. At 3:03 a.m., Portland is beginning to organize supply sharing between their dispersed Augusta positions. The central warehouse concept from safe zone operations is being adapted to distributed supply caches that serve multiple defensive clusters. Portland is learning that centralized supply created vulnerability and that distributed supply creates resilience. Each cluster needs basic independence rather than dependence on central distribution. At 3:05 a.m., Manchester is implementing rotating defense schedules. Each cluster has watch rotation, rest rotation, and reserve rotation. The 12,000 people in Laconia are being organized as 12 independent but coordinated defensive units. Manchester Command is creating a federation model instead of a centralized hierarchy. Each cluster has autonomy. Coordination happens through communication, not through command authority. At 3:07 a.m., Rally Point Alpha's Worcester reoccupation is facing its first test. Infected are probing the dispersed positions, not massive assault. Individual encounters and small group probes. Worcester's defensive clusters are engaging independently and successfully. Each cluster is managing its own defense without requiring central coordination. The dispersed model is being validated through actual contact. At 3:09 a.m., the temperature has risen to 40 degrees. The overnight low is past, and the slow warming toward dawn is beginning. 3 hours and 23 minutes until sunrise. The cold that was dangerous is becoming manageable. People who survived the night in cold positions can survive until daylight brings warmth. At 3:11 a.m., I need to talk about what happens at dawn, because dawn changes everything. Dawn brings visibility. Dawn brings warmth. Dawn brings the ability to assess positions in daylight and make decisions about next moves. Groups that established positions in darkness will see their situations clearly. Some will decide their positions are viable. Some will decide to relocate. Dawn is when temporary decisions become longer-term commitments. At 3:13 a.m., the Boston firefighter in Quincy reports that his fire station has been quiet for hours. 50 first responders maintaining a defensive position that hasn't been tested seriously. The firefighter believes the infected concentration is lower in Quincy than in central Boston, and that the fire station is defensible long-term. He's asking if there are any coordination networks being established for first responder positions. I'm telling him that coordination networks collapsed and first responders are operating independently. He acknowledges and states that Quincy Fire Station will maintain position and will coordinate with other first responders if contact is established. At 3:15 a.m., Portland is reporting that Augusta's dispersed positions are being linked with communication networks. Ham radio operators in each cluster are establishing contact with other clusters. The clusters are sharing information about infected locations, defensive successes, and resource status. Portland is building horizontal communication instead of vertical command. The network is peer-to-peer instead of hierarchical. At 3:17 a.m., Manchester's cluster federation is functioning. All 12 clusters are in communication. All 12 are reporting secure positions. Manchester Command, which now means coordination between cluster leaders instead of centralized command authority, is discussing supply sharing and mutual defense protocols. If one cluster comes under serious pressure, adjacent clusters can provide support. At 3:19 a.m., I'm watching through radio traffic as decentralized survival evolves into organized, decentralized defense. The survivors aren't creating the safe zone network. They're creating something different. Smaller units, distributed positions, horizontal coordination instead of vertical hierarchy, resilience through redundancy instead of strength through concentration. It's emerging organically from the experience of watching concentrated positions fail. At 3:21 a.m., Rally Point Alpha is reporting that Worcester's dispersed defense has repelled multiple infected probes without serious casualties. 20,000 people in multiple positions are defending successfully where 50,000 people in one position failed yesterday. The difference is distribution. Infected that concentrated on the safe zone are dispersing when they encounter multiple smaller targets instead of one large target. At 3:23 a.m., the New Haven survivor in the rural farmhouse is reporting that infected movement past their position has stopped. The road outside is quiet. The group of 12 in the farmhouse is maintaining position and planning to stay through the day to assess whether their location is viable long-term. Rural isolation is proving effective for small groups who can remain invisible. At 3:25 a.m., I'm receiving a call from someone identifying as Rhode Island National Guard who evacuated from Gillette with Rally Point Charlie convoy. The Guard unit has established position in northern Rhode Island and is coordinating with local police and civilian groups. The Guard soldier is asking if there are any operational FEMA command structures or if military units are operating independently. I'm telling him what I've told everyone. Communication networks collapsed and groups are operating independently with local coordination only. At 3:27 a.m., the pattern across all reports is the same. Groups establishing defensive positions. Groups organizing internal structures. Groups coordinating with adjacent groups. But no central authority. No network command. No FEMA coordination. The system that existed 14 days ago is gone. What's emerging is something bottom-up instead of top-down. At 3:29 a.m., Portland is discussing with their cluster leaders about establishing long-term sustainability in Augusta, agriculture for food production, water system maintenance, power generation from local resources, medical care systems. Portland is planning for extended survival instead of temporary defense. They're transitioning from crisis response to sustainable operations. At 3:31 a.m., Manchester is having similar discussions. The Lakes region has agricultural resources. The area has water from lakes. Manchester's clusters are discussing how to transition from consuming existing supplies to producing new supplies. Long-term thinking instead of short-term survival. At 3:33 a.m., Worcester's reoccupation is stabilizing. 20,000 people in dispersed positions are defending successfully and are beginning to organize supply distribution and resource management. Worcester failed as a safe zone in 12 hours. Worcester, as a dispersed defensive area, has now held for 1 hour and is showing signs of viability for longer-term defense. At 3:35 a.m., I need to address what success looks like after safe zone failure. Success is not restoring the network. Success is not returning to pre-outbreak normal. Success is groups of people maintaining defensive positions and coordinating with adjacent groups and surviving day to day while building towards sustainable operations. The survivors are defining success differently than FEMA defined it. FEMA measured success by how many people were protected in coordinated facilities. Survivors measure success by whether they're alive tomorrow and whether their position is holding. At 3:37 a.m., the temperature is 43 degrees. Dawn is 2 hours and 55 minutes away. The night that saw 6 safe zones fall and 3 evacuate is approaching its end. The people who survived are in positions they've established or reached. The immediate crisis is past. What remains is the longer-term question of whether those positions can hold and whether the survivors can build something sustainable. At 3:39 a.m., I'm going to stay on this frequency through dawn and beyond. I'm going to coordinate communication between groups. I'm going to relay information. I'm going to document what happens as decentralized survival becomes the new reality. And I'm going to be the voice that connects groups that can't connect directly. At 3:41 a.m., the Northeast Safe Zone network is gone. 9 zones fallen or evacuated. Approximately 100,000 survivors scattered across 4 states in positions ranging from individual households to clusters of thousands. The coordinated system that promised protection collapsed. What's emerging from the collapse is uncoordinated but functional survival. Small groups doing what large systems couldn't do, adapt and survive. The safe zones fell. I watched them fall. And now I'm watching the aftermath. The survivors building something from the pieces. Whether what they're building lasts longer than what failed won't be known for days or weeks. But they're building. And I'm broadcasting. At 3:43 a.m., Portland is reporting that all 30 clusters in Augusta are secure and that cluster leaders are meeting via radio. Conference to discuss long-term governance structure. Portland is creating something that looks like a council or federation instead of a command hierarchy. Each cluster has representation. Decisions are collective. The safe zone model was military command. The Augusta model is emerging as civilian self-governance. At 3:45 a.m., Manchester's Cluster Federation is implementing similar structure. 12 cluster leaders coordinating through communication instead of through command authority. Manchester is discovering that 12 clusters of 1,000 people each are more resilient than one group of 12,000 because each cluster can make its own decisions and adapt to its own circumstances without waiting for central approval. At 3:47 a.m., Worcester is organizing supply distribution across its 20 dispersed positions. Each position has basic supplies. Central warehouses are being established for bulk storage, but each position maintains independence. Worcester is learning from the safe zone supply failures, where centralized distribution created vulnerability when central facilities were breached. At 3:49 a.m., I'm receiving reports from smaller groups across the region about their status and their plans. The family in suburban Boston is staying in their fortified house and believes they can hold indefinitely with their supplies and defensive preparation. The church group in Vermont is organizing their small community for agricultural production. The mall group in Connecticut is establishing trade relationships with adjacent survivor groups. Decentralized survival is becoming decentralized society. At 3:51 a.m., the National Guard units that evacuated from Gillette are establishing coordination between military positions, but they're not, attempting to re-establish centralized command. Guard units are embedding with civilian groups or maintaining independent positions and coordinating as peers instead of as command hierarchy. The military is adapting to the new reality that centralized military command failed and that distributed military support to civilian groups might succeed where command failed. At 3:53 a.m., the temperature is 46 degrees. Dawn is 1 hour and 39 minutes away. The night is ending. The survivors who made it through are preparing for daylight and for the decisions that daylight brings. Some will reinforce positions. Some will relocate to better positions. Some will attempt to reach family in other regions. Dawn is decision time. At 3:55 a.m., I need to talk about what I'm seeing from this frequency that represents larger patterns. The safe zone network failed because it concentrated people into targets, because it required continuous external support, and because it created single points of failure that cascaded when they fell. The decentralized survival that's emerging is succeeding because it distributes people into multiple positions, because it creates local self-sufficiency, and because it builds resilience through redundancy. The survivors are learning from failure and building systems that avoid the failure modes. At 3:57 a.m., Portland's Cluster Council is discussing outreach to other survivor groups in Maine. They're talking about establishing communication networks with groups in Bangor, Augusta's surrounding towns, and rural areas. Portland is expanding from internal organization to external coordination. The Federation model is growing. At 3:59 a.m., Manchester is discussing similar outreach into New Hampshire surviving communities. The Lakes region has multiple towns with survivor populations. Manchester's Federation is attempting to create coordination without creating hierarchy. Horizontal networks instead of vertical command. At 4:01 a.m., Worcester is beginning to see dawn's first light. The eastern horizon is brightening. Worcester's 20 dispersed positions are becoming visible in pre-dawn light instead of just radio positions in darkness. Worcester Command, which means the coordination between position leaders, is assessing defensive situations in visibility for the first time. Positions that seemed viable in darkness are being confirmed viable in daylight. At 4:03 a.m., I'm receiving fewer radio calls than during the night's peak. Either people are secure in positions and don't need to call, or they're too busy with dawn preparations to communicate, or they've been lost. The decrease in call volume suggests stabilization. The immediate crisis chaos has been replaced by organized defense preparation. At 4:05 a.m., the Boston firefighter in Quincy reports that his fire station is preparing for dawn by establishing watch positions with daylight visibility. 51st responders are transitioning from nighttime defense to daytime operations. The firefighter states they're confident in their position, and they're planning to maintain indefinitely. At 4:07 a.m., Rally Point Bravo in southern New Hampshire is reporting that their defensive positions in commercial districts are holding successfully and that they're beginning to organize for long-term operations. 20,000 evacuees are transitioning from emergency evacuation status to established community. They're discussing governance, supply management, and defensive coordination. At 4:09 a.m., the pattern I'm seeing is that groups larger than a few thousand people are establishing formal governance structures. Council models, federation models, coordination committees. The groups are creating social organization to manage populations that are too large for informal coordination. They're building society at small scale. At 4:11 a.m., Portland's Cluster Council is discussing education for children in their positions. The 30,000 people in Augusta include approximately 4,000 children. Portland is talking about organizing schools within clusters. They're thinking beyond immediate survival to sustained operations that include normal social functions, like education. At 4:13 a.m., Manchester is having similar discussions about maintaining medical care, food production, and infrastructure maintenance. The 12,000 people in Laconia are organizing as a functioning community instead of as a temporary defensive position. They're planning for months or years instead of days or weeks. At 4:15 a.m., the temperature is 49 degrees. Sunrise is 17 minutes away. The night is ending. Dawn is bringing light and warmth and the ability to assess situations that were unclear in darkness. The survivors who made it through the night are preparing for the day. At 4:17 a.m., I need to address what this broadcast has been for the past 5 hours. I've coordinated communication between groups that couldn't communicate directly. I've relayed information about positions and threats and successes. I've documented the fall of the Safe Zone network and the emergence of decentralized survival. And I've been a voice for people who needed to hear a voice that represented something larger than their immediate isolation. At 4:19 a.m., whether this broadcast mattered tactically is unclear. Whether it changed outcomes or saved lives or improved coordination is unknown. What I know is that people called this frequency all night, and they said it helped. Medical officer at Gillette, firefighter in Quincy, families in farmhouses, groups in churches. They called because they needed connection. And maybe connection is enough justification for staying on air. At 4:21 a.m., I'm going to continue broadcasting through the day. The crisis is not over. The situation remains dynamic. Groups are stabilizing, but stabilization is not the same as safety. And someone needs to maintain communication coordination, even though the command structure that was supposed to coordinate is gone. At 4:23 a.m., Worcester is reporting that dawn visibility confirms their dispersed positions are viable for sustained defense. 20,000 people in 20 positions across Worcester can see their defensive situations, and they're confirming that distribution works where concentration failed. At 4:25 a.m., Portland and Manchester are reporting similar dawn assessments. Positions are viable. Defenses are holding. Organization is functioning. The clusters and federations that were established in darkness are working in daylight. At 4:27 a.m., The New Haven survivor in the rural farmhouse is reporting that dawn shows the road outside is clear. The infected that passed during the night are gone. The farmhouse group of 12 is alone in rural Massachusetts with supplies and defensible position and apparently successful invisibility. They're planning to maintain position. At 4:29 a.m., rally points Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie are all reporting successful transitions from night to day. Approximately 80,000 Gillette evacuees are in positions that held through the night and are preparing for sustained operations. At 4:31 a.m., the sun is about to rise over New England. Over approximately 100,000 survivors scattered across 4 states in positions ranging from individual houses to clusters of thousands. Over the ruins of 9 safe zones that promised protection and failed. Over the emergence of decentralized survival that might succeed where centralized coordination collapsed. At 4:32 a.m., sunrise. The eastern horizon goes from gray to orange to gold. Light spreads across Massachusetts and Maine and New Hampshire and Vermont. The night that saw the Northeast Safe Zone Network fall is over. Day 15 of the outbreak begins. Hello, listener. The safe zones fell. I watched them fall. Approximately 100,000 people survived by evacuating to dispersed positions. They're building something from the pieces. Small groups, local coordination, horizontal networks instead of vertical command. Whether what they're building lasts longer than what failed won't be known for weeks or months. But they survived the night. They're organized. They're coordinating. They're adapting. This is WGBH Emergency Broadcast, operating on backup power from Brighton, Massachusetts. I'm staying on this frequency. I'm coordinating communication. I'm documenting what happens after safe zones fall. The network collapsed. Decentralized survival emerged. And I'm broadcasting to whoever's listening because someone needs to remember that we tried coordination. It failed, and something else took its place. Stay in your positions. Maintain your defenses. Coordinate with adjacent groups. And survive day 15